Driven by pure hatred, she infiltrated her enemy's tribe with a single goal: to destroy him. But fate would transform her into the protector of those people and the mother of the only heirs of the man she swore to murder. If stories about how understanding can be born from the deepest pain resonate with you, subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together. The Chihuahua sun beat down on the parched earth, but no dryness was greater than that which had gripped Ximena Montes's soul. Kneeling before two makeshift wooden crosses, she dug her nails into her palms, feeling a physical pain that barely rivaled the emptiness in her chest. There, under that merciless sky, lay her father and brother, victims of a devastating attack, a trail of violence that everyone in the village blamed on the Apaches. Her tears had dried, replaced by a cold, cutting flame. On the earth that covered her dead, she swore a silent oath, a promise sealed not with tears, but with a hatred that redefined every fiber of her being. Revenge would be her only mass, her only prayer, and she would seek it in the heart of enemy territory, no matter the cost. That day, 19-year-old Ximena, known for her easy smile and indomitable spirit, died along with her family. In her place was born a shadowy figure whose once bright eyes now held the hardness of obsidian. Grief earned her a new name among the villagers, La Loba. They saw in her posture the rigidity of a wounded predator, ready to hunt. She knew she lacked the strength of a warrior or the power of an army, but she possessed a weapon that in her grief-twisted vision was equally lethal: her beauty and her cunning. Her plan was perverse in its simplicity: allow herself to be captured, infiltrate the community that had stolen everything from her, and use deceit like a slow poison to destroy their leader from within, annihilating the people's hope at its very source. The story unfolded around 1880, a time of blood and dust on the volatile border separating Chihuahua, Mexico, from the lands that would soon become New Mexico. The stage for this drama was the Sierra Madre Occidental, a mountain range as majestic as it was unforgiving, one of the last sanctuaries for the Apache people, specifically a Chiricahua group that refused to surrender. The atmosphere was charged with ancient hostility, an open wound between the Mexican settlers and the natives. To the Mexicans, the Apache were savage specters, faceless killers who emerged from the mountains to pillage and kill. To the Apache, every settler was an invader, part of a relentless tide that stole their ancestral lands and threatened to extinguish their way of life, a desperate struggle for survival in a world that no longer wanted them. Before hatred renamed her, Ximena was the embodiment of the vitality of that frontier. Her spirit was as free as the wild horses that roamed the plains, and her beauty, a blend of Spanish and indigenous heritage, was a beacon of life in her small, dusty village. She was not only beautiful, she was resilient, accustomed to a daily life of hard work and small joys, where family was the center of everything. The brutal loss ripped away not only her loved ones, but also the conviction that honor lay in kindness and forgiveness. Consumed by grief, she came to believe that the only way to honor the memory of her father and brother was through an act of equivalent destruction, a belief that became her only truth, her moral and compass in a world that for her had lost all meaning. In the weeks that followed, La Loba charted her course with icy precision. She studied the tracks, listened to the traders' stories, and eventually identified the hunting routes frequented by Apache warriors. With a small bundle of belongings, she deliberately walked away from her village, heading toward the mountains everyone feared. Each step was a battle against the panic trying to rise in her throat. The vast silence of the Sierra Madre, which had once brought her peace, now felt like a stalking predator. Her senses were on high alert, interpreting every breath of wind, every shadow of a cloud, not as the beauty of nature, but as an omen of her encounter with the monsters that haunted her nightmares. She was driven not by courage, but by a purpose so dark that it drove her forward, transforming fear into fuel for her mission. The encounter unfolded as she had predicted. They emerged from the rocks, silent as ghosts, their muscular figures and piercing gazes even more intimidating than the legends described. They were three warriors. Instinct screamed at her to run, but hatred held her in place. Ximena forced a scream of terror, falling to her knees and covering her face, playing the role of the terrified victim perfectly. Behind her hands, however, her calculating eyes peered, analyzing the leader of the small group, trying to decipher the hierarchy, searching for any sign that would lead her to the chief, the man she identified as the architect of her pain. In that moment, she was no longer Ximena Montes, a farmer's daughter. She was an actress on the stage of her own tragedy, and her performance had to be flawless for the final act to come to fruition. Ximena's courage at this moment is what inspires us. If you feel this strength too, show your support by leaving a comment. And to not miss a step of this and other incredible journeys of overcoming, be sure to subscribe to the channel. The journey to the Apache camp was long and exhausting, a silent journey through the depths of the Sierra. Ximena expected brutality, but what she found was professional indifference. Her captors didn't speak to her, moving through the rugged terrain with a familiarity that left her astonished, treating the mountains not as an obstacle, but as an ally. At dusk, they arrived at a rancheria hidden in a sheltered valley, invisible to the outside world. The sight surprised her. Instead of the chaos and filth she had imagined, she found an organized community with wiki-ups arranged in a cohesive pattern, and the smell of food cooking over the fire. It was home. This realization hit her with unexpected force, the first dissonance in her symphony of hatred, a touch of normality that didn't fit the image of the demons she had come to exterminate. As she was led to the center of the camp, under the curious but not openly hostile gazes of the villagers, Ximena forced herself to search for signs of the savagery that fueled her revenge. Yet what she saw continued to challenge her certainties. Children ran and played, their laughter echoing through the valley, a scene of universal innocence that hurt her ears. A group of women worked on deerskins, chatting in hushed tones, and in a place of honor near the main fire sat the elders, whose opinions were clearly listened to with deep and unquestioning respect. Where were the bloodthirsty monsters from her village's stories? She tried to convince herself it was a facade, a calm before the storm, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That scene of humanity was poison to her hatred. The days that followed transformed Ximena from a captive observer to a reluctant participant. She wasn't chained or mistreated as she expected, but simply put to work with the women of the tribe. Her hands, previously dedicated to sewing and cooking in her own home, now learned to grind corn on a metate stone and treat hides with ancestral techniques. Communication was through gestures, but in the universal language of shared labor, she saw the strength and resilience of these women. They helped each other, cared for each other's children, and shared what little they had with a generosity that baffled her. With each passing day, the wall of hatred in her heart suffered small cracks. She reminded herself of her mission, telling herself it was a ruse, but the routine of a communal and supportive life made it increasingly difficult to sustain the image of the monsters she had created. It was late one afternoon, while fetching water from the stream, that she saw him for the first time. Kael, the warrior leader, was returning from a patrol. He was not the caricatured demon of her revenge fantasies, but a man whose presence commanded a respectful silence. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with an economy of gestures that denoted power and confidence. The scars on his arms told stories of battle, but his eyes did not hold the cruelty she expected, but rather a sharp intelligence and a profound weariness. Seeing him, all the hatred that had been dormant by routine awakened like a serpent. That was the face of her enemy, the architect of her downfall. She lowered her eyes, her heart hammering in her chest, reaffirming her oath. The humanity that surrounded her was an illusion. He was the reality she had come to destroy. Kael's presence reignited the fire of vengeance in Ximena. Another figure in the camp posed a different, more subtle danger. It was Nakai, an older warrior whose features were a map of wrinkles and wisdom. Kael's advisor, his eyes seemed to carry the weight of all the betrayals his people had suffered. He didn't see Ximena as a mere captive. He saw an unknown, a piece out of place that could threaten the fragile balance of that community. Ximena felt his scrutinizing gaze constantly on her, a silent scrutiny that made her uneasy. Unlike the others, Nakai's distrust was a nearly impenetrable wall. He was the guardian of the scars of the past, and with every gesture, with every sidelong glance, he challenged her to prove she wasn't the poison he suspected her to be. One night, Ximena's routine was abruptly shattered. Kael approached her, his face impassive as ever. Beside her, holding her hand, was a small boy of perhaps 5, his eyes swollen from a recent silent cry. Kael spoke in broken Spanish, a language he rarely used, explaining that the boy's parents had been killed by Mexican soldiers last moon. Then, with a gesture that shocked Ximena to her core, he placed the child's small hand in hers. It wasn't an order, but a charge, a silent test. He was entrusting her with the care of an orphan of her people, forcing her to confront a pain that mirrored her own. The irony was cruel. The woman who had come to destroy suddenly found herself in the position of having to nurture and protect. Initially, Ximena cared for the boy, whose name was Taza, with bitter reluctance. Every act of care was a betrayal of her revenge. As she fed him, she saw the faces of her family's killers. As she cleaned him, she felt the enemy's touch. She acted mechanically, efficiently, but devoid of any warmth, maintaining an emotional distance that was her last line of defense. The boy, in turn, was a silent ghost, too traumatized to speak, accepting her care with a passivity that disturbed her. To Loba, that child was a burden, a constant reminder of the humanity of the people she had to hate. She clung to that coldness like an anchor, fearing that any shred of compassion would drown her and divert her ship from the dark course she had charted for herself. The wall of ice began to melt on a cold night. A muffled scream woke Ximena from her uneasy sleep. Taza sat trembling, his eyes wide with terror from a nightmare. Before she could stop herself, instinct took over. She moved closer to him, wrapping him in a hesitant embrace. His small body nestled against hers, seeking refuge, and in that contact, something fundamental broke within Ximena. He wasn't an Apache. He was just a frightened child who had lost everything, just like her. For the first time in months, the tears that welled in her eyes weren't of hatred, but of overwhelming compassion, a shared grief that transcended bloodlines and battle lines. By comforting little Taza, she was unknowingly beginning to comfort herself. From that night on, the dynamic between Ximena and Taza changed. Irrevocably, the boy's silence was slowly replaced by a childlike trust. He began to follow her around the camp, her little shadow. One day he offered her a hawk feather, a treasure to him, and for the first time since arriving, Ximena smiled. A genuine smile, one that surprised even herself. She began teaching him lullabies in Spanish, and he, in return, showed her which roots were edible and which insects were best avoided. In this silent exchange of knowledge and affection, Ximena found pieces of her former identity, the woman capable of love and nurturing. Each of Taza's laughs was a melody that soothed her wounded soul, but also an alarm that warned her how far she was straying from her sacred oath over her family's tomb. On her darkest nights, when her affection for Taza frightened her, the figure of Doña Elvira haunted her thoughts. She remembered the matriarch of her village, her face a mask of bitterness, clutching her arm tightly on the day of her funeral. The only good Apache is a dead Apache girl, the old woman had said, her black eyes burning with the fire of an ancient loss. "Do not forget that. Avenging our dead is the only law that matters in these lands." Elvira's voice was the echo of prejudice, the embodiment of the collective hatred that had sent her on this mission. She represented the memory that refused to heal, the pain that demanded more pain in return. The warmth of Tarza's hand in hers competed directly with Doña Elvira's phantom grip, a battle within her between the future she was building and the past that refused to die. Ximena's bond with Tarza did not go unnoticed by Kael. The Apache leader, who until then had treated her with a measured distance, saw something in their interaction that intrigued and worried him. He observed the softness that had returned to the captive's face, but he also saw the flashes of original hatred that still burned in her eyes when she looked at him. One night, as Ximena was putting Tarza to bed, Kael approached the fire near which she sat. For the first time, he addressed her not as a chief, but as a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He spoke of war, of loss, and then, looking her directly, he told her he knew the fire that consumed her inside, for he himself carried a similar fire in his own heart. It was then that the truth was revealed to her, a truth that demolished the pillar of her revenge. Kael explained that the attack on her ranch had not been an act of her tribe, but a desperate act of retaliation carried out by a small group of renegades. The family of those warriors, their wives and children, had been massacred by Mexican soldiers a week earlier, a brutal crime that never reached the ears of her village. They attacked the first ranch they found, blinded by pain and grief. "Your hatred has one face," Kael said, his voice deep and weary, "but ours is a 1,000-faced monster that has hunted us for generations. What happened to your family was the echo of a pain we suffered first." In that instant, Ximena's world disintegrated. Her revenge, so pure and just in her mind, was just another link in the endless chain of hatred. Kael's revelation left Ximena adrift in a sea of inner chaos. For days, she moved through the camp like a sleepwalker, performing her tasks on pure instinct, while her mind grappled with the new and terrible truth. The simple, just narrative that had fueled her journey, that of a virtuous victim against savage perpetrators, had shattered into 1,000 pieces. Now, she saw only victims on both sides, trapped in a cycle of retaliation that had no beginning or end. Looking into the faces of those around her, she no longer saw the enemy, but the reflection of her own pain, her own grief. The identity of La Loba, the avenger forged in the fires of loss, dissolved, leaving behind only Ximena, a lost woman, stripped of her purpose and forced to face the emptiness that hatred masked. With the veil of vengeance lifted from her eyes, her perception of Kael underwent a seismic shift. The monster she had come to murder disappeared, replaced by the figure of an overburdened leader, a man fighting to protect his people from annihilation. She began to notice nuances she had previously refused to see: the way he listened attentively to Nakai's advice, the fairness with which he mediated internal disputes, and the restrained kindness with which he treated Tarza and the other children. She saw the exhaustion on his shoulders at the end of the day, and the determination that lifted him each morning. The hatred, now without a clear target, began to morph into a feeling that frightened her even more, a grudging respect bordering on admiration. He was not the cause of her pain, but another prisoner of the same senseless war. Ximena's admiration opened the door to a silent communication between her and Kael. Their interaction began with small gestures. She, who had learned from the other women about the use of desert plants, one day saw him treating an arrow wound and, without hesitation, prepared a poultice of creosote leaves to prevent infection, a skill that had not belonged to her people but which she now mastered. Kael accepted the care with a nod, an acknowledgement worth 1,000 words. On another occasion, he watched her teach Tarza how to make a small bird trap, a technique from his homeland, and a rare, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. In those moments, they were not an Apache leader and a Mexican captive. They were simply a man and a woman finding common ground in the universal language of survival and care. The final bridge between them was built on the foundation of their shared grief. One full moon night, sitting by the low simmering fire, Kael spoke. He told her about his first wife and son, killed not by soldiers but by a disease that swept through the camp years before, a loss that taught him the fragility of life. His voice, usually strong and commanding, was charged with a vulnerability that mirrored her own. Emboldened by his sincerity, Ximena spoke for the first time about her father and brother, not as martyrs of their revenge, but as the men she loved, sharing tender memories of their lives before the tragedy. By sharing their wounds, they made them less heavy. In that moment, beneath the gaze of the stars, love blossomed, a feeling as unlikely as it was powerful, born not despite the pain, but because of it. The love between Ximena and Kael became a silent, undeniable force within the camp. It wasn't announced with ceremony, but woven into the tapestry of everyday life, in the way she waited for him to return from his hunt, in the way he sought her gaze amidst the crowd. The final proof of her acceptance came where she least expected it. One morning, Nakai, the suspicious old warrior, approached her as she was repairing one of Taza's sandals. He said nothing, but placed at her feet a small leather bag containing rare corn seeds, a gift of great value that symbolized planting and continuity. In his wrinkled face, Ximena no longer saw suspicion, but hard-won respect. In that gesture, she understood that she was no longer the outsider, the captive. The community that had welcomed her out of obligation now embraced her by choice, seeing her as part of its future. A few moons later, Ximena felt a shift within herself, a certainty that was as terrifying as it was miraculous. She was pregnant, Kael's child. The heir to the man she had sworn to murder was growing inside her. The irony of her fate was overwhelming. The body she had brought to this territory as a weapon of seduction and deception had become a sanctuary for the next generation of her enemy. Her entire past, her oath, her former life in Chihuahua seemed to belong to someone else, to a distant era. Now, her destiny was inextricably linked to Kael's and the Apache people. This child was not just a son, it was a living symbol of the bridge between two worlds, proof that from the most arid soil of hatred and pain, life somehow always found a way to flourish. The months passed in a peace Ximena never imagined possible. Her pregnancy progressed, and with it, her place in the tribe solidified. She was no longer an anomaly, but a vital part of the community. She taught the women how to make preserves from desert fruits, a technique that ensured food during the harshest winters, and used her sewing skills to mend clothes and blankets with a skill they admired. She moved around the camp with the familiarity of one who belonged, her prominent belly a symbol of hope and continuity for all. By Kael's side and caring for little Taza, who now called her mother, she found a purpose that came not from destruction, but from building a home and a family, a safe haven in the heart of those wild mountains. But the tranquility of the Sierra Madre was a fragile illusion. Scouts returned to camp with grim news. The Mexican government had intensified its extermination campaigns, and worse, was offering generous rewards for Apache scalps, attracting the scum of the border. Ruthless and efficient bounty hunters, a cloud of apprehension hung over the rancheria. Smiles became rarer, and the nighttime campfires, once filled with stories and songs, were now the scene of silent, tense war councils. Ximena saw the worry etching new lines on Kael's face and felt the collective fear like a physical presence. The threat was no longer a memory of the past or a distant tale. It was a hungry predator approaching, its scent of gunpowder and greed carried on the wind. The attack came with the dawn, a betrayal of the rising sun. Ximena was mending a blanket for her unborn child's crib when the first shot rent the air, followed by a deadly volley. The sound was unmistakable, the dry crack of bounty hunters' rifles, distinct from the deeper thud of Apache muskets. Screams of panic and pain replaced the peaceful sounds of the morning. Suddenly the camp was transformed into a hell of smoke, gunpowder, and fear. Ximena's first instinct was a primal roar of protection. She grabbed Taza, pushing him to the safety of a crevice in the rocks behind her wickiup, her body acting on pure maternal instinct to protect the child she loved and the life she carried within her. The world she had built with such effort was being incinerated before her eyes. The chaos was absolute. The hunters, guided by some traitor or ancient information, advanced with relentless ferocity, their faces contorted with greed. The Apache warriors, though caught by surprise, quickly formed a desperate line of defense, fighting with the fury of men defending their homes and families. Ximena saw Kael, a leader amidst the maelstrom, cutting down an enemy while shouting orders to his men. She saw Nakai, the wise old man, fight with the dexterity of a young man. And then she saw one of the women who had taught her to cook fall, struck by a stray bullet. In that moment, time stood still. Before her, two paths opened: flee through the mountains, a traitor to both sides, or stay and fight. The choice was final, and there was no more time to hesitate. There was no more hesitation. The past, with its oath of vengeance, turned to smoke and ash. What mattered was the present. Taza's frightened cry from the rocks, the image of Kael fighting for their lives, and the pulse of new life within her. Ximena of Chihuahua died. Forever, in that instant, and in her place, a protector arose. With a fury born not of hatred, but of the fiercest love, she rushed toward a fallen warrior and grabbed his bow and the quiver with the few remaining arrows. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from overwhelming determination. Every fiber of her being screamed a single truth. This was her family, these were her people, and she would rather die defending them than live even a second as a coward. Her fate, sealed by love and blood, would be decided there, on that red earth. Her contribution to the battle was not that of a seasoned warrior, but that of an unexpected strategist. Ximena knew the mentality of the men of her land. She knew they would expect the Apaches to hide on the heights, so instead she shouted for a small group of women and young women to take shelter in a low ravine, a place the hunters would overlook in their arrogance. Then, using her knowledge of the terrain, she set fire to a dense clump of dried creosote, creating a thick, acrid smokescreen that disoriented the attackers and gave Kael's warriors precious seconds to regroup. She fought not with brute force but with cunning, using the memories of her old world as a weapon to protect the new, proving her loyalty unquestionably in the crucible of combat. The smoke and confusion created by Ximena gave the warriors the chance they needed. Kael led a fierce counterattack, exploiting the bounty hunters' disorientation. The fight became a brutal hand-to-hand combat, where the Apaches' desperate courage overcame their enemies' superior weaponry. Realizing the battle was lost and the cost of each step forward was too high, the remaining bounty hunters retreated, fleeing in disarray back the way they had come, leaving their dead behind. Gradually the war cries faded, replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the lamentations of those who had lost loved ones. Victory did not taste sweet, but rather the bitter metallic taste of survival. Amid the silent carnage that followed, Kael's eyes searched for Ximena. He found her near the rocks, her face smeared with soot, still holding her bow, while Taza clung to her legs. Their gazes met over the battlefield, and in that instant, any remaining doubt was shattered. He didn't see the stranger, the captive of an enemy people. He saw the mother of his children, a warrior who would bleed for her family, a woman of the Ande, the people, in body and soul. Nakai approached them both, limping from a leg wound, and placed his hand briefly on Ximena's shoulder. It was a gesture of profound respect, the elder's final acceptance. The inner peace she had so long sought came not with revenge, but with loyalty, tested in the fire. In the days and weeks that followed, the community dedicated itself to the slow and painful task of rebuilding. Wounds were treated, the dead were mourned according to sacred rituals, and the damaged wiki-ups were rebuilt. In this healing process, Ximena became a central figure. She moved tirelessly through the camp, her presence a source of calm and strength. She helped care for the wounded with the herbs she had learned to use, distributed food, and most importantly, sat with the widows and orphans, offering comfort that came from a place of deep empathy, for she knew their pain intimately. Her former identity had completely faded, and now she was simply Ximena, a woman of the people, whose worth was measured not by her blood or origin, but by the strength of her spirit and the depth of her compassion. Spring arrived in the mountains, bringing with it not only the blossoming of vegetation, but also the rebirth of hope in the form of new life. On a quiet night, with the help of the tribe's midwives, Ximena gave birth to her first child, a strong, healthy boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's gentle features. The child's arrival was celebrated with restrained and reverent joy by the entire community, a balm for the still fresh wounds of battle. When Kael held his son in his arms for the first time, a rare smile of pure happiness lit his weary face. For Ximena, holding that small life against her chest, the journey found its ultimate meaning. The cycle of hatred that had consumed her had been broken, replaced by a cycle of love whose future now rested in her arms. Years later, the image of Loba was only a whispered legend in a distant land. In her place sat Ximena, a mother of two, sitting under the shade of a pine tree, her hair braided with turquoise beads. Beside her, her eldest son, now a curious boy, and her youngest daughter listened intently to her stories. One afternoon, she would tell them about the patron saints of her former village in Chihuahua. The next, she would recount the Apache legends of the white-painted woman who brought wisdom to the people. She had become a guardian of two cultures, a living bridge between two worlds that insisted on remaining at war. In her children, who carried the blood of both peoples, she saw not a contradiction, but the fragile and precious hope of a future where the boundaries of hatred could be dissolved by understanding. Peace never truly came to those lands. The war of extermination continued to ravage the frontier, and the Apache's fight for survival became increasingly desperate. The resolution of this story was not found in the silencing of rifles, but in the silence that settled in Ximena's soul. She understood that true honor for her dead lay not in replicating the violence that had taken them, but in building peace, even if only in the small sanctuary of her family. Her victory was not the death of her enemy, but the death of her own hatred. She learned the hard way that revenge is a hungry ghost that devours those who seek it, while love, even when born of pain, is the only force capable of cultivating new life in the desert of desolation. One late afternoon, as the sun painted the canyons with hues of orange and purple, Kael returned from a long patrol. He sat beside Ximena, his body weary, but his eyes finding peace in hers. He took her hand, a hand now calloused from work, but which to him represented refuge and strength. His children played nearby, their laughter the only necessary music in that vast silence. They needed no words. Their understanding was forged in shared battles, mourned losses, and the quiet joy of watching their children grow free, at least for now, under the sheltering sky of the Sierra Madre. In that moment of stillness, they were the embodiment of a world that could have been, a small oasis of peace amidst a desert of war, a testament to the power of two people who chose love over hate. Over time, Ximena's story was woven into the oral traditions of the Kael people. She was remembered not as Na Kai, Ye, the Mexican outsider, but as Ija Now E, she who walks between worlds. Her journey became a lesson in caution and hope, as tale taught to children about how the human heart is a territory more complex and mysterious than any map. Her story served as a reminder that an enemy can carry pain similar to one's own, and that true strength lies not in the purity of one's blood, but in the ability to adapt, forgive, and, above all, protect the family one chooses. Her life became a legacy, living proof that even the most poisonous seed of hatred can, with time and courage, be transformed into the most resilient of trees, offering shade and fruit for future generations. The journey of Ximena Montes, the woman who entered the heart of enemy territory to destroy it and ended up becoming its protector, transcends the boundaries of her time and geography. It is a timeless chronicle of the nature of pain and the redemptive power of love. She shows us that the lines we draw between us and them are often just scars from wounds we refuse to understand in the other. Her transformation from a ruthless avenger to a matriarch who bridges two worlds is a testament to the extraordinary human capacity to unlearn hatred. She forces us to ask, in our own lives, how many bridges could we build if we had the courage to look at our enemy and see not a monster, but the reflection of our own wounded humanity? Ximena's story teaches us that resilience isn't about not falling, but about the strength we find to get back up and the wisdom to choose a new path. If this message touched your heart, and you believe that understanding is the most powerful weapon against hate, subscribe to the channel and share this journey with others. Your presence enriches our community and inspires us to continue seeking stories that matter. We'd be honored to hear where you're watching from, so leave your city in the comments. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you on the next journey.